Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mike McMahon. I'm the Executive Director of the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada. And today I have the privilege, the joy of having a conversation with Adam Tice. Many of you already know Adam. I can see from the attendee list that many of you are friends and acquaintances of Adam. But he's made a tremendous contribution to the congregational singing of churches throughout the United States, or actually throughout the English-speaking world. When I was preparing for today, I was, really struck that Adam has more than 250 texts published in 5 volumes. And you pick up any hymnal today of the major denominations, and you're going to find his very, very compelling texts throughout. We were talking a little before we started today, and Adam has the distinction of being the youngest living person ever named a fellow of the Hymn Society. And it may seem strange to have someone that young to be a fellow, but he's made tremendous contributions, and I'm grateful for the influence that he's had in churches that I've worked in. So, Adam, welcome. It's good to be with you.
Hi, yeah, it's great to see a lot of friends' names pop up on the attendees list. I have one eye on the chat, so see all these greetings coming in from all around the world. It's exciting.
Indeed. So that reminds me that I wanted to say that if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, do feel free to put it in the chat. I'll be monitoring that throughout, and we can have you join in the conversation. So, well, I was wondering if we could kind of start at the beginning. Like, how did you get into all this? What were the influences in your early life that attracted you to church and ministry and music and singing?
Yeah, I grew up in a church-going family, and I particularly remember our family moved around a number of times growing up. So I was born in Pennsylvania, then I lived in Alabama from age 3 to age 8, then in Oregon from 8 to 15. And 8 to 15 is a pretty formative stretch of time growing up. And there I got involved in a children's choir that was directed by my elementary school music teacher, and I was involved in that choir through middle school, and then in the sort of high school version of that choir in eighth and ninth grade before we moved away. And that was my sort of immersive experience into group singing, and the my love of melody, my love of harmony, my desire to spend my life in music somehow or another. Um, it took a while longer to translate that into uh, doing that work in the context of the church. That came a bit later during college. That I had initially started out with a music education major and then switched over to music composition, and it was my composition teacher in college, Lee Dengler, who encouraged me to do an internship with him at College Mennonite Church here in Goshen during my senior year of college. And that's when I started to really embrace the idea of putting that work, putting the musical work uh, primarily within the context of churches. And then it wasn't until seminary that I figured out I was better on the word side, that I could take my musical background and apply that to writing texts, combined with my theological education at that point. And sort of all those things convened into making me a hymn writer.
Wow. I did not realize that you had a background in composition.
Mhm.
I guess it makes me wonder, when you write texts, are you hearing tunes already when you write these?
It depends. Sometimes I do, and particularly if I'm writing to a traditional meter, I'll have a couple of tunes in mind to test out the text. Um, I kind of find that I will, my craft ends up being better if I'm not too strongly attached to a melody while I'm writing. Because sometimes something will sound really good with a particular combination of notes that won't stand as well on its own without those notes attached. And if I'm writing in a traditional meter, I want to be able to potentially interchange the tunes. And, just as a writer in general, I want the text to stand on its own merits even before it's wedded to a tune. So I try not to be too strongly attached to a tune. Now that said, if a composer sends me a tune that they're excited about that needs a text, then I'll certainly work that direction too.
That's interesting. And what's your preference? How do you like to work?
I'd say more often I go text first. I'm sort of the opposite of Mel Bringle that way. Mel loves to have a tune to craft a text to, and I generally will go the other direction. And like I said, it's for me, I will I find myself being stricter with myself, more intentional and careful about the text itself if I'm not allowing the tune to pull me in certain directions.
That's really interesting. So just get back to your background. So you went to college and then off to seminary, and how did that develop? And then how did you get into church ministry?
Yeah, I kind of joke that I got a master's by accident. I because I was a composition major in college, I was unemployed after graduation, as often happens. I was able to piece together a little bit of church work, but not much. But I saw a course advertised at the Mennonite seminary 10 miles away from me on Congregational Song. And it was taught by Rebecca Slough, who had edited the 1992 Mennonite hymnal. Um, and so I was excited about taking that course as a way to further my compositional work. Um, and it was an assignment from Rebecca in that class to write a psalm paraphrase and to take no more than 30 minutes to work on it because it would probably be really frustrating. That assignment came out really well, and I was really happy with the text that emerged. And in fact, that text is in a couple of hymnals now. Um, and Rebecca said to me at some point during that class, Adam, these texts that you've been working on are better than any of the tunes you've shown me. Having spent 4 years working on a composition degree, that was a little bit of a gut punch, but it was one that I needed uh, to set a new trajectory for my life. So I ended up taking more seminary classes, and often in class, a professor would say something interesting, and I'd start writing something in meter and finding some rhymes, and I'd miss the rest of the lecture, but I'd have a hymn by the end of it. And I just kept taking classes and ended up with a degree after a few years. And
Wow.
then it was another one of those sort of unintentional things that happened that I ended up being a pastor for a while because I was in seminary for several years without the intention of pastoral ministry. I was still seeing myself primarily on the musical side of things. Um, but I preached once in chapel towards the end of my last year in seminary, and one of my friends took me aside to have a conversation about why I wasn't planning on being a pastor. And I didn't have any good answers, and so I became a pastor for a while.
That was here in the DC area, right?
Yeah,
That's what,
I was associate pastor at Hyattsville Mennonite Church, which is within the DC Beltway on the
yeah,
Maryland side.
that's pretty cool. One of the things I've noticed too is you've written a lot of text that people find compelling, and they kind of stir the imagination in unexpected ways. Unexpectedness kind of seems to be a theme with you. That you read one of your texts and it's like, wow, I had never thought about things that way before.
Mm.
Um, and I guess it just makes me wonder, what's going on in you that brings out those kinds of texts.
Yeah, I love the phrases that you used there. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is theological imagination and the idea that imagination itself is a way of entering into what God intends the world to be, even when we're not able to see it on other levels. So it's our imagination and our dreaming that is sort of an enactment of prayer, an enactment of um, visualizing and entering into sort of an eschatological vision of what the world can be. Um, and for myself, I haven't seen too many people describe it this way, but I really find this idea rooted in what I see as Mennonite theology, that of putting an emphasis on participation in what God is doing in the world and seeing ourselves as called to enact what God is doing through ourselves, through our lives by God's power, um, even when the world around us it feels like it's something completely different. Um, and so I think I would suggest that it's in part my Mennonite background that brings those things forward in my writing. There is a lot of what God is creating in the world, what God is making new, and envisioning what is real but is beyond our sight in what God is doing.
That's really interesting because, it seems like in Western mm, theological thought, imagination has had a sort of bad rap,
Mm.
right? And so to see it sort of flowering in your work, brings just a whole different dimension to the way we relate to God in our song.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of what accounts for the way that some of my texts have been embraced ecumenically is that this is kind of a different angle or a different perspective that it it took a Mennonite to sort of crack that egg, I guess. And I think other people are certainly doing it too, but because it's so central to my theology, I think it comes through in an interesting way.
You recall sitting at dinner with a rather well-known church leader one time who was sort of bemoaning clergy who had overly active imaginations, and it sort of stands in contrast with what we're talking about right now. And also in 2022, when we had our 100th anniversary, the theme that John Thornburg sort of proposed that we adopted was "Sing the World That God Imagines." And so not only our own imaginations, but also kind of thinking of God's imagination too, which I
Yeah.
find also a very compelling image.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a theological honesty in recognizing that we're we're clearly not living immersed within what God intends the world to be, but there is a reality that is what God intends that is within our grasp and within our reach, and that we're invited to enact and to participate in.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I love that idea of God imagining it into being.
I was wondering, you were talking about your Mennonite influences, and I'm wondering if there are aspects of your work that are distinctively Mennonite, or
Yeah, I think it's often unfair to say that something is exclusively Mennonite or that only Mennonites would talk this way, but I think uh, there's a way of that I talk with a Mennonite accent, or that my theology has a Mennonite accent. And
yeah,
so, I mean, there's probably an excessive amount of peace in my work because we're a peace church.
that
There's
plus,
yeah, um, there's this emphasis on our participation in God's work. Uh, One of the places where I've been intentionally Mennonite focused, recognizing that this means some churches won't be able to sing song XYZ, is in the area of adult baptism. Seeing baptism as primarily a personal commitment to participate in God's work, a voluntary thing um, that somebody consciously and actively participates in, rather than something that's primarily an act of the church on behalf of an individual. Um, both things can be true at the same time, but there's kind of a dearth of hymnody that makes sense in adult baptism contexts because we haven't had many people writing them previously, because so much of our hymnody has been borrowed from other traditions.
It just kind of makes me real think about how um, rich the tapestry of Christian practices
Yeah.
is and how we enrich one another through that. Um, I've I've sort of considered myself an ecumenical Christian for a long time, and the thing about baptism sort of makes me think about that too, because there's been a great recovery of adult baptism, and in denominations that have traditionally been almost exclusively oriented to children and infants, and
Yeah.
so those hymns I think are pretty needed throughout the church, not just
Yeah,
among
and that's made me
Anabaptists.
laugh too. There's a piece or two that I've written thinking, oh, this is so Mennonite that nobody else will ever sing it, and it ends up in a Catholic hymnal. So yeah,
Right.
it's a great
Exactly.
surprise when things like that happen. So, and yeah, I
You
mean,
know,
one of the amazing things about all of our hymnals, ecumenically, they are we all sing borrowed theology. There is no hymnal that is purely stuff produced by people within that tradition, because if you used a hymnal like that, frankly, it would be really boring, and it would be a monochromatic image of what faith is and can be. But because we're borrowing and learning language from one another all over the place, we get such a rich tapestry uh, of what our Christianity can be. And you can assemble your faith from all of these different sources, and it's the compilation that comes to look like your own faith tradition rather than the individual components on their own.
so that brings up the issue of hymnals, and I know you've had a lot to do with with hymnals, and I think I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about Voices Together. For those who don't know, Adam was the text editor for the most recent Mennonite hymnal in the United States and Canada, and I'm wondering what that experience was like, just kind of based on what you were talking about.
Yeah, it was an incredible experience. We had a really, really good, talented, strong team of people. We were able to work collegially together, um, and basically come out the other end still as friends, which doesn't always happen from what I've heard from other hymnal committees. Um, it,
Uh,
it was too short of a process. We only had really 4 years from our first meeting to holding the book in our hands, whereas the previous hymnal of our denomination took over 10 years to assemble. Um, and so it was a really intense marathon over the course of a sprint, or vice versa. I don't know which way it was, to produce the book, but it was invigorating.
What do you think of hymnals? And I'm asking this because of what you said about how we enrich one another's theology. So it means there's always new stuff coming at us. Um, what is the value of a hymnal today,
Yeah,
in your
it,
opinion?
it's an interesting question, because as I wound down my time on the Mennonite Hymnal Committee, I took this position at GIA where I'm editor for Congregational Song. And part of my job is every week putting a couple of new hymns up on the internet for people to be able to find and use. And there's so many of these that I think, goodness, if we just had this 3 years ago, I'm sure this would have made it into Voices Together. There's always wonderful new stuff coming out. But I'm also committed to the idea that congregations end up forming a canon of stuff that sinks deep into individuals' beings and forms their faith and forms part of who they are. And if you're on a constant diet of new material all the time, you don't get a chance for stuff to sink in. And so having a new hymnal once a generation or so, or once every 15, 20 years, or, in our case, it was almost 30 years. It's a way to refresh that pool. It's a way to recognize what is that material that's sunk in over the past 30 years that we need to hold on to. and what are places where we need some fresh water mixed in? How can we stir the pool a little bit? So it's a both and thing. I love and believe in hymnals. I love the idea of people who really care about this work getting together and making good decisions that reflect what a denomination is going to need for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Um, and yet I keep writing. Even though I know at this point, Mennonites aren't ready to sing new songs because they're still finding new songs in the hymnal to sing. It takes quite a long time to sort of pick and choose and find what's going to fit for your congregation. Uh, but yeah, like you said, I've written far too many hymns already, and I keep writing new ones because I keep finding things to write about.
As an editor, you're out now helping other people to write and help to refine their craft. I wonder what it's been like the transition. I don't know if it's a transition, but the relationship between being a writer and being an editor and a mentor.
Yeah. Well, I want to point to one of your predecessors, Carl Daw, for teaching me both sides of that equation. From very early on, when I started attending Hymn Society conferences, Carl sort of took me under his wing and uh, became my first reader for everything I write, and still is to this day. And what I learned from him was very early on. We would talk through hymns first by phone, then by email, and he might send suggestions for revisions to a line, and I might respond with, well, I see the reason the change needs to happen, but I might say it more this way, and we would kind of go back and forth. But we reached a point where he would send me suggestions and it would sound exactly like what I wanted to say. And what was happening was that Carl learned my voice and learned how to think and write in a way that I would do. And so his suggestions came to reflect uh, a cohesive picture of what my texts were becoming, and making me a better version of myself rather than making me an imitation of Carl. And so that's something that I really aspire to when I'm working with writers, is not just making them carbon copies of Adam Tice, but making them the best Dave Bjorlin or the best Hannah Brown or the best Eli Cooper Nelson that they can be, bringing out what their voice is in their writing.
This may seem out of the blue, but I'm just asking anyway. So, have you used AI at all in this craft?
No, no, I've seen a couple of examples of telling AI to write a hymn in the style of so and so, but I haven't explored using it as a tool really.
I wasn't even thinking of it in terms of actually writing the hymn, but in terms of learning your voice and making
Mhm.
suggestions. And when you said that, it sounded just like AI. Oh, like it was a real person.
Actual intelligence instead of.
Yeah, that's right. Actual intelligence. Although interesting. You've been very involved in the Hymn Society for a long time, and you began your relationship as a Lovelace Scholar. And what if you talk a little bit about I don't know, your journey with the Hymn Society and how you've contributed and how it's contributed to you.
Yeah. I just want to say I see Andrew's comment here, and I really appreciate that. Thank you, Andrew. Um, uh, yeah, I actually became a member in 2000, so a few years before I was a Lovelace Scholar, so I was still a college student. And the funny thing is, my first issue of the hymn that came was, I think, the 80th anniversary issue of the society, and it had a listing of the fellows of the Hymn Society there. And I remember seeing on that list Mary Oyer, who I'd
Uh,
gotten to know already while I was a college student at Goshen, and thinking just what a amazing thing this was, this list of people, and got hooked very quickly into the society. So yeah, then after graduating from college, and then when I started seminary, it was the summer after my first seminary course where I wrote that hymn text that I came as a Lovelace Scholar to Collegeville, Minnesota. Um, and I remember looking around and seeing how few people there were with hair that was not white or gray. There were very at that point, and I think particularly to that conference too. There were five of us Loveless scholars who were young, and maybe a couple of other young people. And so that was kind of my first taste of the Hymn Society. Um, but I was hooked enough that I knew I was going to be back, and keep coming every every chance I got. And the only year I've missed the conference was when my son Ezra was born on July 9th, before the
Oh,
St. Olaf conference in 2009. So that's the only conference I've missed. Um, it, as I said, Carl kind of took me under his wing, and a couple of years after I kept coming back, I was brought onto the executive committee, and I kind of think of it as I was the first token young person on the executive committee, and it very quickly, I think, became habitual that we as a society needed to hear young people's or younger people's voices on the executive committee. And my observation has been since that time, there has always been somebody young or younger-ish, and not just as the I forget the name of the position, the three non sort of titled positions at large. Is that what?
yeah.
Or so now we've had young presidents and young treasurers and secretaries too, um, but very early on, at the second conference I went to, um, uh, Anissa Bacon and I started gathering the young people, who all of the young people that we could find, but especially former Lovelace scholars and current Lovelace scholars. We started gathering them for informal meetings, um, and alongside of that, a few years in, every year we started seeing these cohorts from SMU that would show up. And so they came with some built-in relationships, and we were starting to form community as groups of younger people at the conferences through these meals. And I, from my perspective, pretty quickly, retention and repeat attendance started spiking for people in that age group. People started coming back over and over again. We started the society started the second year Lovelace program at some point. I don't know, around 2010 or something like that, maybe a little after. And that again boosted repeat attendance. Um, and so one of my favorite observations over my time in the society, now that I'm one of the older people, is that this active involvement and ownership of the society by emerging adults and younger adults has just grown and grown. And so it's really exciting to me to see all these young whippersnappers now, people in their 20s that make me feel old, are really such an active and vibrant and regular part of what the society is.
It's really true. And this year we've introduced a third year
Hmm,
Lovelace program. So uh,
great.
it continues to expand. And I would affirm your observation that um, the age variety in the society is really strong and life-giving to
Yeah, and it gives me hope that even our attendance has fluctuated for a long time, but it's been on overall a downward trajectory. But the energy that's there and the generation of leadership that's been actively involved now, um, is thrilling and gives me hope that we have something sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'm wondering what kinds of things going on that you would like to see the hymn society develop more.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the continually growing edges, I think, is um, how how do we encourage and continue to invest in scholarship related to contemporary worship music? Um,
Mm.
I think that's where some of the most exciting scholarly work is happening in our field. Um, and I think there has been this tradition of uh, either skeptical antagonism or sort of hesitant embrace sometimes. Um, and what I get excited about is when we can approach that with a full-throated and full-hearted embrace of the scholarship itself, um, as an avenue into a greater understanding of the genre, whatever our feelings about that may be. Um, I fall on the side of a generally enthusiastic embrace of the genre. There's certainly places where I have hesitancy and skepticism, but I think, as with all genres of congregational song, we benefit when we can understand it better, and we benefit when we can do that from a posture of anticipating and appreciation rather than starting from a position of antagonism. Uh, uh, I see a comment from Jan here that there seemed to be no text by me too. And Jan, I would just point out that I was born in 1979. So that's why I don't have anything in 1982. Um, I haven't really broken into Episcopal hymnals yet, partly because of the Episcopal publication schedule, I think. There hasn't been much coming out from you folks in the last little while. Uh, and yeah, Hannah just posted a nice link, Jan,
I
where
didn't get that. Could you try again?
computer needs
Oops.
to talk to me, and I don't know why. Um, Link to where you can see a lot of my work on the GIA website.
But yeah, that's a good place to look. Are you working on anything right now that's interesting?
Yeah, yeah. The last couple of years, I haven't been doing very much of my own writing. I think the hymnal project and then my work at editing has kind of taken my creative energy and also given me a perspective on what needs to be written yet, and partly and also who needs to be writing it. Um, so I don't have the sense of urgency that I once had to write my own stuff. Especially when I began writing, I was thinking I was writing as a Mennonite for Mennonites, and then I was pleasantly surprised to discover that a whole bunch of other people wanted to hear that too. But still, sort of my mental trajectory was pointed towards next time Mennonites came out with a hymnal. Um, and I certainly did what I could in that direction. So since that time, I haven't felt the same urge to write, and I've been discovering other writers with backgrounds and identities and lifetimes that are so different from my own that I want to hear from. And so my editing energy often goes towards that. But just the last month or so, I've had a little bit more of an itch to write a few things. I have a, a piece that Sally Morris and I are working on. We wrote a refrain for it several years ago that I'd totally forgotten about, and Sally brought the refrain back to me. and I've written some verses for the refrain that do something I want to do, but they're not really what Sally was looking to do with it. So we're trying to negotiate now. Maybe we have two different hymns, I don't know, but I've been working on that a little bit. And I also have a new commission that I am going to be working on in the next day or so. Um, and I'm really looking forward to representing the society at a songwriters workshop in Iona. And I leave in about a week and a half to head to Scotland. And that kind of, I think, is getting my creative juices going again, too. Doing a lot of gathering of ideas about the craft of songwriting and thinking about what are the songs that the world needs right now, and how do we put those two things together to make interesting music. And I see Jillian is on the call too. Jillian is one of our co-presenters who's based in England, and we're really excited to have her as part of those workshops.
I'm going to go back to the voices together for a second. You and Sarah Kathleen Johnson published an article in the Hymn about the process of dealing with texts and evaluating texts and choosing texts and revising texts and so forth. That sounded like a really, really thoroughgoing process, more than I think I've heard from other editorial committees. And I'm wondering if you just talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, I think I would put it this way, that historically hymnal committees have either basically retained historical material as it was, maybe with a few tweaks here and there for comprehensibility, or they've given themselves a set of standards to which they were going to revise texts. Um, so, for example, in the 1992 Mennonite hymnal, they had an approach that language for humanity would be updated from exclusively masculine to finding rewordings that were inclusive, and language for God would be dealt with essentially based on how old the text was. That modern texts, they would expect to use inclusive language, but they were going to retain masculine God language for historical texts. So they gave themselves these sort of rules that they could then apply as they were going through the editing process. Um, and we've observed other hymnals where they had different sets of rules or different ways of applying them, but there was this kind of standards-based approach. We found that with the variety of the material that we were working with, both modern and historical, but also intercultural and intergenre, talking about introducing contemporary worship music, that having a set of rules would lead to problems, because how are we going to apply our set of rules to a Black spiritual at the, compared to a contemporary worship music song, compared to an Isaac Watts text, compared to a Brian Wren text? Um, each of those has its own background, it has its own set of concerns, and there are certainly issues of cultural sensitivity involved in especially dealing with the intercultural side. So rather than write a set of rules to follow, we gave ourselves a list of a list of questions to ask of each text, and really of each word of each text. How does this text present who God is? How does this sit in balance with the other material in the book? How does our experience of singing this text shape who we are? Um, how is this text held by the prior or preceding generations, and how will it shape future generations? Um, so we really made it hard for ourselves, because we ended up having to ask these questions of every song, but it meant that we weren't constrained to one single approach to make all of these changes. Um, and so you will find masculine language for God alongside feminine language for God. You will find hymns that contrast light and darkness in ways that are related to sin and evil. And you will find hymns that deal with light and darkness that very intentionally separate those concerns and treat darkness as positive. Um, because one size fits all approaches just are end up homogenizing too much, I think. And so there are internal contradictions within the hymnal. There are ideas that may compete with each other, hymn to hymn. But ultimately, it meant that, but with any hymnal, these things mean that you're not going to please everybody all the time. And I've said if 100% of people were totally happy with every decision we've made, then it's a huge mistake that we have a problem. Everybody, like, we should have equal opportunity experiences of finding things that challenge you within the hymnal.
You said before more than one thing could be true at the same time, right? It's wonderful to have a hymnal. It's full of paradox, so to speak. We're coming up to the end of our time, and there are so many questions I have. I'd love to keep going, but I do want to ask you two more questions. One is about what do we need to have? What do we need in our repertoire? What kind of hymns do we need to have written right now, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the important questions for us to be asking is who are the voices that we're not hearing from yet or haven't heard from yet? Um, I got excited about finding those as an editor, that people writing things that I couldn't write as a straight white Protestant male living in 21st century United States. So new voices is a big thing. I, I think there are topics that we haven't quite known how to deal with yet. I think for the last 30 or so years, one of those growing topics has been the environmental crisis. And we've had a really kind of huge number of hymns written that address environmental issues in exciting ways now that's been shaping our hymnody. And so I wonder, what are the next topics that we may not even quite realize yet that we need some hymns to be able to sing those. Since Hannah Brown's on the chat here, I would point to a couple of her texts as things that I couldn't necessarily have written myself, that need to be said, and the church needs to be able to sing them. She has a text called "Bless What Is Breaking" that can be used as the church processes divorce or other broken relationships. And she has another really beautiful one that can be used following miscarriage. And in fact, both of those have great tunes by Kate Williams. And just to, gonna put on my GIA employee hat, this just came out. This is Kate Williams' new tune collection. And earlier this spring, this is Hannah Brown's text collection. So both of those songs you can find in both of those places and on giamusic.com/unbound.
That's cool. It does kind of point to how badly we need a variety of writers and voices in order to express the breadth of Christian experience. It's really important. So one final question that has to do with the Hymn Society, and that would be, what would be your fondest hope for the Hymn Society as we move forward?
Yeah. I think to be a resource for, like, a go-to place for anybody involved in church music at any level, that they know if they go to the Hymn Society, they'll see themselves represented in what the society does, musically and theologically, that it can be a place of community and a place of resource that that really ought to feel indispensable if you're in our line of work. And so that's where I think continuing uh, to welcome with open arms genres that have traditionally been outside of what we've thought of as congregational song is part of what keeps revitalizing who we are as a society.
Thank you for that. And I like the word indispensable. I think that's a great way of describing it. Well, I'm really, really grateful for this time together and hearing your story and your insights. Thanks so much for that, Adam. Thanks to all of you for being with us today. Next month is our last interview for this season, and that's with Ben Brody. So hope to see you all then. Thanks very much. Take care.
Good to see you all in the chat.
Walk in the Spirit of God, and when you walk, Christ is there.